Was Jesus wrong when he said the mustard seed was the smallest of all the seeds? What's good, everyone? Thank you for watching The Noted Gospel. Today we're asking, was Jesus wrong when he said the mustard seed was the smallest of all the seeds? Now, there's a reason why we're asking this today. If you didn't know, a certain type of orchid holds the crown for having the smallest seed. Now, this sounds contrary to what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 and 32, in which he says that the mustard seed is the smallest of all the seeds. Skeptics like to use this information to say that Jesus said something wrong. So, was Jesus wrong? Well, let's take a closer look at the passage and see what's going on. Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 and 32 say this, "And he presented another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all the seeds, but when grown, it's taller than the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the sky come and nest in its branches." So there's a line. Jesus says that the mustard seed is the smallest of all the seeds, when in fact, today we know that a certain type of orchid holds the crown for the smallest seed. However, once we look at this passage in detail, we'll see that this isn't really an issue at all. One thing you have to do when you're reading a Bible passage is you have to look at context. This is the most important rule. Context, context, context. So let's look at it. First, we notice that Jesus is saying a parable. And in this parable, Jesus mentions that the mustard seed is the smallest of all the seeds and that a man sows this seed into the ground. In other words, Jesus is using an example of a farmer for this parable. Now, it's probably the most important piece of context here is that Jesus is speaking to people in the first century. He speaks in a relatable fashion, in a fashion that will help people understand what he's talking about. And so today's context is different from a first century context. In that first century context, the smallest seed that farmers cultivated at the time was the mustard seed. If Jesus was to say that the smallest seed was this seed from an orchid plant, the people wouldn't understand it. So at the surface, it might look like Jesus is giving some false information, but when we take a closer look and we look at the context, we see that Jesus is using an example that fits the first century people. You see that Jesus is speaking truth, that the smallest seed that they knew of, that they cultivated at the time, was the mustard seed. So remember, when you come across a difficult passage, take into account the context, and that most likely will straighten out any misconceptions one might have. To summarize, was Jesus wrong when he said that the mustard seed was the smallest of all the seeds? No. When we take into account that Jesus was speaking in the first century to these Israelites, we know that the mustard seed was in fact the smallest seed that farmers cultivated at the time. If you like this video, like, share, subscribe, drop down any questions or ideas in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you guys next time.